Hello everyone, welcome to the St. Mary's YouTube channel. I'm Zach Goodwin. I'm a St. Mary's congregant and former youth group member. For my debut video for this channel, I thought I'd talk a little bit about a figure who's very important for my own faith, and that is Oscar Romero, who was a Salvadoran priest that was active in the 1970s, right before El Salvador's descent into civil war. So I'll talk a little bit later about why he's so important to me, but I thought I'd start with a little bit of biography. So Romero was born in 1917. He joined a seminary at the age of 13, very young. He was raised Roman Catholic. He then went on to study in Italy and was ordained in 1943 when the fascists were still in power and when World War II was in full swing. He then returned to El Salvador, served at several parishes, mostly in rural and poor communities in the 1960s and into the 1970s. Before this, he had been a rather socially conservative type of priest who was really focused on these grand ideas, I guess, of universal salvation and heavenly salvation. But that sort of began to change in the 1960s and 1970s because what was happening in El Salvador was this rise in inequality and in violence. There was the beginning of these paramilitary campaigns and human rights abuses that would really that were leading up to the civil war that would take place during the 1980s. And so Oscar Romero began to witness some of this in 1977, the same year that he was appointed the Archbishop of San Salvador. He saw a fellow priest of his by the name of Rutilio Grande get assassinated by these right-wing paramilitary forces. And then in 1979, that paramilitary junta took power and began an institutionalized campaign of oppression all throughout the country and seizure of resources and all of this. And so at that time is when Oscar Romero really began to focus almost exclusively on social justice issues. His homilies were super focused on combating poverty, denouncing human rights abuses, denouncing the hypocrisy of the church establishment and the political establishment, denouncing the United States for their support of a regime that was committing human rights abuses. And it was very subversive at the time to have a priest that was talking about all these things, that was speaking directly to the poor, and that was calling into question the established authority. And it actually meant that in 1980, while he was giving homily, he was assassinated by the government. Many, many years later, after a lot of debates in the Vatican, he was canonized in 2018. Throughout that time, he was still an inspiration, even in death, to the Salvadoran people. He remains a uniquely popular figure there. So in terms of why I'm interested in him, obviously I'm not Salvadoran, but I did spend 8 weeks there last summer. I did an internship with a human rights group. I lived with a Salvadoran host family, and I got to travel all around the country. And that was sort of my first exposure to Oscar Romero, was being there in El Salvador. I should say that when I went to El Salvador, I was at a sort of a junction point in terms of my own personal faith and my Christian identity, that I wasn't so sure if I wanted to continue being a Christian. I felt rather cynical. I had spent the past few years from Trump's election watching the rise of this right-wing, very socially conservative evangelical movement that didn't speak to me at all, and that felt to me, in fact, counter to humans' best interests, counter to human rights. I thought it was harmful, and I didn't see how I could reconcile myself with that as a Christian, with this movement that was the most high-profile Christian movement in the country. When I got to El Salvador, the first thing I noticed in regards to Oscar Romero was how ubiquitous he was. He was by far the most popular figure that I've ever seen in any country. I mean, his face was on everything. Streets named after him, buildings named after him, museums, churches. My host family had 3 portraits of him in their house. I bought this little shirt of him from a market. They were everywhere. I've truly never seen a figure that beloved by everyone. What that meant was that even as he was beloved by the people, and by people who were poor, by people who were less privileged, the people that he had been speaking to when he was alive, it also meant that he had been sort of co-opted by the people that were in power, and including by a lot of people who had committed really grave atrocities during the Civil War. Now that they were in the current government, they would speak to his legacy all the time. They would dedicate things to him. And I realized how hypocritical that was, because he wasn't really speaking to those people, especially a lot of these people who might have even ordered his death. So the first thing that made me realize, I saw the parallel between the co-optation that was happening here in El Salvador and that was happening here in the United States. It made me realize that this mixing of religion and power is a narrative that occurs all over the world. And it also made me realize why I hated that so much, and it's that it makes religion feel so detached from humanity and from your own personal importance. I had nothing, I didn't feel like I could relate to this sort of state authority religion. That wasn't what had spoken to me when I was a member of St. Mary's. What had spoken to me was being with fellow congregants and doing good by them and doing community service and all of that. So I realized that this was the part of religion that I didn't like, is when it mixed with power. What I then realized, though, is that this is a phenomenon that has a lot of historical precedent, if not biblical precedent. I mean, when I heard the story of Oscar Romero, not to be blasphemous, but it reminded me a lot of the story of Jesus Christ, and that Romero was a social revolutionary. He was someone that was subversive. He was someone that was disliked by the ruling authority. He was someone that walked with people that were poor, that were socially outcast, that were somehow socially othered. And he was ultimately killed for that, as was Jesus, by the state authority power. And then, in both contexts, there was this sort of co-optation of that movement. I mean, the Roman Empire eventually adopted Christianity, and the Salvadoran government has sort of adopted Oscar Romero. So what I realized is that religion has the potential to be this social revolutionary force, this subversive force, this transformative force, but power always seeks to co-opt that ability or that potential. So then I started thinking about, how do we combat that? How do we return religion to its transformative roots, if you will? And I sort of began thinking of this idea of personal ideology of subversion. This was the first time this idea of radical love and radical kindness really started to click for me. Those words, the pairing of those words. Because in a world that is oppressive and in a world that has all these socioeconomic and political structures that keep certain people down, it is radical to walk with those people who are oppressed. It is radical to love and be kind and to serve those people that others are ignoring. And so for me, there was this idea of a theology of subversion, this theology of combating authority, of positioning yourself as someone who's religious in opposition to the established power. And while I was coming to this sort of personal realization, I realized that this was already a rather established theology in Latin America, not just through Oscar Romero, but through this idea of liberation theology, which was born out of a mix of left-wing Catholic thought and Marxism in the 1960s and 1970s. I know Marxism might sound like a scary word here, but all it really meant was that they saw their goals as the same, which was the liberation of people from social, political, and economic oppression, which was seen as the way to liberate one's soul, was to liberate them from, to go on a crusade as Jesus would have in this current world, to liberate one from material oppression. So I saw that, I guess, in El Salvador for the first time as sort of an acting theology, as an acting ideology, and it spoke to me a lot. And so that's sort of what I walked away with, was this understanding of Oscar Romero as someone, a religious figure who did try to do good, which gave me the idea, or reaffirmed the idea that religion can be used to do good. And it also made me realize that this narrative of religion combating with power, getting co-opted by other religious movements, having to work to subvert it, is a narrative that's always been true and that always will be true. And it's something that I think as conscientious Christians, we have to be conscious of, and we have to work to combat. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was informative. I hope it told you a little bit about who I am and my personal faith. And I look forward to hearing about your thoughts and seeing this channel grow. Thank you.